And at that time, um, it was really thought about in terms of like inner figures.
Yeah.
Um, and it's only, later that sequestration of the imagination has been able to lose those false boundaries so that we can think about speaking to a tree as Martin Buber did. Um, we can imagine the voice of the river, and we can begin to put alongside talking with the multiplicity of imaginal figures, talking in dialogue with the multiplicity of people from different standpoints and perspectives.
Mary Watkins, thanks so much for joining me once again on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Brian.
Well, you're the first person that I'm talking to as I do a kind of a celebration of what is it, the 50th anniversary of James Hillman's Revisioning Psychology, published in 1975, a year after I was born.
Okay.
So I'm inviting on a number of people who have either known him personally or have otherwise been influenced by his work to celebrate his life and his ideas. And yeah, we spoke a few weeks ago, I guess, and I thought, let's talk about James Hillman, his effect in your life, and also this other figure who you call a kind of a intellectual father, Paulo Freire,
Yes.
who my listeners might not be so familiar with. And the way, okay, so let me just talk a little bit give a little bit of background as to how we got here having this discussion, I guess. So I'd been reading Hillman for a long time, doing kind of deep readings of his work. And I was particularly struck by his critiques of modern psychotherapy. And, they really resonated with my experience. And I started to dig around and see, has anyone else been critiquing psychology and psychotherapy? And that led me to, websites like Mad in America, which led me into liberation psychologies and Paulo Freire. And reading about these critical psychologies, I thought, my God, there's a lot of shared ideas here, shared critiques that James Hillman put forward. But I never saw his name mentioned anywhere, and I never saw Hillman mention these liberation psychologies or critical psychologies. He seemed to be kind of in his own world doing his thing. And so I started to put these two names together, Paulo Freire and James Hillman, and that led me to your work on both of them, your writing on both of them, which was a surprise and a delight for me. I had really only known of your work on imaginal psychology. What is the book called? Is it Invisible Guests?
The first one was Waking Dreams, and the second one was Invisible Guests, the Development of Imaginal Dialogues.
Right, and I think Tom Moore had put me on to Invisible Guests a number of years ago, but that's all I'd known about your work. And so to see that you had been putting these two thinkers or these two approaches together for quite some time was like really exciting for me. I felt, wow, okay, someone's already been there, someone's seen the connections. I'm not alone, and knowing that these two guys should be in dialogue together. So anyway, that's kind of like what inspired me to reach out to you in the first place.
Well, that's
So,
a great story. I'm so happy to hear that.
okay, good. Yeah, hopefully it wasn't too long-winded. Let's start with James Hillman because he was the first one of these men who came into your life and fairly young. And I just love to hear what you were doing when you encountered the work of James Hillman for the first time.
Right, and I can lead into my encounter with revisioning psychology. So I had written Waking Dreams as my undergraduate thesis at Princeton, And the year after I graduated, I was working nights as a mental health worker at Cambridge City Hospital, and also living in a halfway house for young people who had been diagnosed as schizophrenic. My job was the cook. It was unpaid work that volunteers did, because there was the idea along Langsian lines of living together. So one night, around 3 o'clock in the morning, as I checked in on the people who were in the psychiatric wing, I came upon a woman who was attempting to kill herself. She had a plastic bag over her head, and I had to remove that bag and get her some help, etc. And I was pretty shaken. I was 22 years old, and as it happened, I had an appointment with a Jungian analyst the next morning, analyst I'd been working with for a few months, and named Davida Tenenbaum. And when I went to see Davida, she said, "You know, you really need to read this book by James Hillman called Suicide and the Soul." And so I went about the business of trying to find this book, Suicide and the Soul, and it had been stolen or taken out of every library in New England. And finally, through interlibrary loan, I got a copy from North Carolina. It's since been republished and is much easier to find now, I think. And I didn't know, really, I don't think I knew anything about Hillman when I picked up that book. But when I got into the middle of the book, I was really profoundly grateful for his perspective on working with people who were dealing with suicidal ideas and possibly intentions. And that was that, contrary to the prevailing philosophy, treatment philosophy at that time, where you were not supposed to really talk that much to the person about their plans, their ideas, their fantasies about suicide, because it was thought to encourage them to kill themselves. Hillman said, actually, in such a situation, the person's liveliness, their sense of being alive is circumambulating around suicidality. And if you don't talk to them about what is most important to them, you're robbing them of their connection to their own vitality and life. And I thought that was really true, that you really needed to meet the person where they were, and listen to what was unfolding, even if it might be disturbing to both parties. So I began to read Hillman. What was available at that point, I think, was Myth of Analysis, and his earlier book on emotion, and decided to go to the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich to study with him. So at the end of that year in Cambridge, I was accepted at the Institute. I think I was one of the two youngest people. The other one has become my friend, Lindy Pai. And when I got to Zurich, I called up Hillman to try to make an appointment. And he had just gone to Yale to give the Terry lectures that were arranged for by Ed Casey, who is now my husband.
Right. And so just to pause for a second, this is 1974 that he gave the Terry lectures, right?
Well, I think he was at Yale, I think, for two falls. The one I contacted him in was 73. And in 74, the winter of 74, he gave the revisioning psychology lectures at the Jung Institute in Zurich. And it the first semester I had there was actually extremely disappointing and rather boring. The second semester, once he arrived back, was really, people were incredibly stimulated, either critically uh, or positively about what he was saying. And it was the first time I had seen a lecture there where there were maybe 100 people in the room. Was You could hear a pin drop. There was a lot of excitement about these talks. And I had already begun therapy, Jungian analysis with another analyst. So I never did end up shifting to Jim. But I think it was in the second lecture at the intermission, um, he started walking directly toward me, and I was looking all around thinking he must be going to see somebody, behind me. And it turned out that my friend Robbie Basnak, whom I know you know because you've done a podcast with him, had told him about my book, Waking Dreams, that I was rewriting to publish. And he came and asked me, could he publish a chapter of it in Spring, the journal that he was editing at that time. And so that, as we worked on that, that was really my entrance to getting to know him. And I can remember he was a little harsh with me at times around that because I was still trying to become more exact in my referencing and bibliography, etc. But he was very supportive of the work that I was trying to do, following approaches to the imaginal in Europe that were what were called guided fantasy. And he shared my critique of those approaches as contrary to really allowing the images that are wanting to come forward in a person's life to do so, rather than to be asked to respond to kind of preset image packages by the practitioner. So that was so that was, I guess, 1974. So yes, that's 51 years ago, right?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the reception of the ideas in revisioning psychology amongst the Jungian crowd?
Um,
Because in a
I
way,
think,
he kind of like inverts or subverts a lot of the what we would say orthodox notions around images, uh, archetypal figures, things like that, right?
well, also the idea of seeking wholeness, or
Hmm.
being involved in a process of what the Jungians would call individuation. He was much more open to seeing the kind of mess of psyche, the polyphony of voices. Um, he wasn't eager to have people think they were trying to tie up their experience into some idea of being balanced and whole. I think he thought that was um, wishful thinking, not really
Yeah.
that possible.
Yeah.
Uh, and and so there were a lot of kind of sacred ideas amongst um, mainstream Jungians that he was, dynamiting, if you will, um, and instead really inviting people into stepping out of what he would call a heroic or imperial ego into what he called imaginal ego, an ego that um, would be able to, instead of trying to dominate conversation with imaginal figures, would really welcome the perspectives and the insights of the multiple, what Jung called little people, that we all entertain in one way or another. Some of us are more familiar with this in dream figures, other of us with active imagination, others of us in really looking at the figures that are present in our everyday thinking and relating to other people. So here, I was obviously a great fan of holding imaginal dialogues and seeing what one could learn. And I remember I was at Robbie's Bosniak's house once in Concord, and there was a conservative Jungian who came up to me without introducing himself. And all of a sudden said, "I've heard that you encourage people to do active imagination in your sessions. Don't you understand that that was against Jung's intention?" So there was, a kind of orthodoxy about when active imagination should be invoked in an analysis. Should it be in the second half of analysis? And should it be like never happen in the office with the analyst, but always something that the person's carrying on with him or herself and then reporting it to the analyst? So Jim was, you know, breaking those conventions, and there was, backlash, right? While for many people at the Institute, and particularly young people, there was a sense of great excitement of, turning the page and having a new chapter in analytical psychology that could be, not as leashed to Jung, deeply appreciative of Jung and learning from Jung, but not in a kind of sycophantic way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but think that there's a real connection there to the work of R.D. Laing and his approach to working with people who, like for instance, have schizophrenia, and his kind of fearlessness in meeting them where they're at and entering into their, what would we say, imaginal dialogues is maybe one way to put it. So certainly that must have resonated with you already having kind of worked in that mode with people.
Yes, yes. And I don't think Hillman actually went as far as Lang in this regard. I mean, I think until he gave up psychotherapy, I think his sessions were more, 50-minute sessions, whereas Lang actually lived in some of his houses of hospitality for periods of time, and as did other people who really understood the virtue of being alongside and supporting people as they went through profoundly um, disorganizing and reorganizing states of consciousness.
Hmm. So you having like lived in that situation and worked with people so intimately, I guess, did it help you not go into the fear around doing active imagination and really following the images and things like that?
Actually, it was very uh, encouraging to me to discover Jung's approach to active imagination. So in my junior year in college, I was kind of fell into a deep depression. There was illness in my family, and I was, in that kind of a depression. Sometimes the veil between the conscious and the unconscious grows thin, and so I was experiencing a lot of very vivid imagination, going to sleep, coming out of sleep, very detailed dreams, um, and and I was like, well, what's this? Because it was actually, a much, a very different experience than I had had earlier. And I can remember the day I was on the couch in a reading room at school, and I was reading the sixth chapter of Jung's Confrontations with the Unconscious, where he begins to talk about, after his break with Freud, he let himself open to the imaginal world and began to develop relationships with the figures that we know about from his writing. And I felt when I read that, oh, okay, now I've got a method. I've got a way to approach what's spontaneously happening for me. So contrary to some who might have felt that was very scary. I felt like, oh, it's less scary now because
Mm.
I can see that he and other people and groups that he's mentioning have long been in relationship to imaginal figures. And so what I should do is find out what that history is, and that's what really led me to my undergraduate thesis. It was a very personal inquiry into, before the time of psychotherapy, what were people doing with these imaginal experiences that are not in and of themselves pathological at all, even though some may claim that.
Right. And you could look at, well, like different forms of shamanism around the world,
Yes,
or Greek theurgy, um, magical practices,
absolutely. Prayer,
right? Yeah.
literary people talking to their characters.
The
Um,
personal relationship to Jesus.
yes,
Hmm.
yes,
Yeah. So it's well established that before psychology, that there was, what would we say, like folk practices around working with inner voices, inner figures.
absolutely. And yet, once kind of mainstream Western psychology got its hands on imagination, it really consigned it to childhood and to psychosis, and it pathologized it. And so I was trying to work to open up the line of development from childhood, into adulthood that would continue to appreciate the multiplicity that is who we are, right?
Mm. Yeah. What is that line from the Gospels about putting aside childish things?
Yes, right,
Right. And so not doing that, but
right.
keeping those aspects of childhood alive.
Yes, and at that time, um, it was really thought about in terms of like inner figures,
Yeah.
um, and it's only later that sort of sequestration of the imagination has been able to lose those false boundaries so that we can think about speaking to a tree as Martin Buber did. Um, we can imagine the voice of the river, and we can begin to put alongside talking with the multiplicity of imaginal figures, talking in dialogue with the multiplicity of people from different standpoints and perspectives. So, my original hope was that this sort of opening to what was then inner multiplicity would be a very good training ground for people becoming better able to engage in dialogue um, in interpersonal relationships and with aspects of nature. But I found that actually, in many cases, it wasn't. And that was because of the ideological split that was being made between um, personal and public, private and public, inner and outer. Um, so
Self
I
and the
think,
world, like it kind
yeah,
of reifies that duality,
right,
thinking of
right.
it just as inner work with inner figures, and these are all in me. There's aspects of my psyche. There's all this kind of possessive language,
Exactly. And
owning my
Hillman,
experience, etc.
once Hillman got into his investigation of the archetypal aspects of whiteness, he has a place where he says that this idea that um, of the inner uh, was really an aspect of a white consciousness that separated itself out from the world and really focused its attention on what was presumed to be interior. And what I tried to do with that was to say, we can pretend that it's interior, but in fact, the world, nature, society, culture, history is bleeding into the psyche all the time. And I discovered this experientially because in 1982, about the time Hillman was coming out with Anima Mundi, the thought of the soul of the world, or something like that.
Thought of the heart and the
Yes, and the
soul of the
soul
world.
of the
Yeah.
world, right? I started having a series of incredible nuclear nightmares, and it led me to work in Boston with Sarah Caldecott and later with Joanna Macy around the nuclear threat at that time. But here I was, at that time I was a Quaker, and I would have dreams where I was a Jewish woman in a synagogue. It's the Sabbath, and I hear the doors slam in the synagogue, and then the sound of a nuclear explosion inside. So that it was like the nuclear laced together with the Holocaust and the Jewish Holocaust. And these, and I wasn't, it was like it was coming out of nowhere, right?
Right. It wasn't something you were kind of investigating already. And
No, it led me into the investigation. And at that time, analysts were saying, if you have dreams about nuclear
annihilation.
apocalypse, that it's because there's probably some problem with repressed anger. So dreams that had aspects of the world were getting reduced back into
Right.
psychological complexes, etc. But I was very clear,
Personalized.
yeah, personalized. I was very clear that this was not what this was about, and it led me into doing work with a man whom I wish we could be talking with now, John Lipsky, who did a lot of work with dream theater. And I I continued that work with my students, and it would be amazing the dreams that people would bring forward that were really engaged with what was happening in the world at a very deep level. I remember after 9/11, one of the dreams brought in was the man was flying in a plane, and all of a sudden he looked down and there was no floor to the plane. And that was during the period when we were worried about white powders being sent through the mail and nuclear plants being exploded, etc. Right? So, I mean, so for me, I was trying to work against this red line drawn between the inner and the outer.
Hmm. Hmm. And yeah, well, there's a lot there. I'm just kind of struck by, growing up in the 80s, the nuclear threat was very real and very pervasive. Like even in southern Ontario, Canada, where I grew up, we had a giant air raid siren in our little neighborhood, and every
Yes,
once in a while it would go off. They do these air raid siren tests, and there was films coming out that depicted nuclear annihilation like the day after.
exactly. Right.
And so it was very real. I can't imagine going to a therapist or psychologist and them saying, well, if you're having dreams about this, it's just because of your repressed anger. It just seems like
Yeah.
such a denial of the effect that the world has on us.
Yes. Yes. And it wasn't something at the birth of psychoanalysis. It was something that happened later. Because in Vienna, in Freud's time, yes, originally he had said people need to pay for psychotherapy for it to be, for them to get any use out of it. But, he quickly took that back and said, No, actually. Um, if you want to be a member of the psychoanalytic society, you have to be willing to tithe a day a week of your time or the money that you gain from that day, because we're going to create free clinics where people will
Hmm.
come, and if they qualify for psychoanalysis, if they're poor, or can't afford it for some reason, um, they'll they'll go through it as well. And at that time, we're talking, 1918 or so. The analysts were involved in setting up kindergartens, um, working to provide education about reproductive health, um, consulting with architects about how to build communities, neighborhoods, and communities that had places where people could connect and form, a sense of conviviality. There were analysts would go um, to factories and teach workers about
Hmm.
psychology.
Wow.
There was an awareness that the aftermath of the First World War had been extremely deleterious for children. And of course, many had been forced into poverty and were really suffering. And that those um, culturally produced um, sufferings, should be the stuff that psychoanalysis attended to. So I was never taught that until,
I've
uh,
never heard that.
yeah. So, um, and we can see it in the people, in some of the people that came later, Eric Fromm, um, Karen Horney, Sullivan, et cetera, that were very much influenced by that. But Neil Altman, in his book, um, talks about that when many of the Jewish analysts came to the United States, um, during and right after the Second World War, they were afraid to bring this perception that mental health was intimately tied up with social and cultural well-being. And so people like Finichel, psychoanalysts, devised what he called a Rundbriefe, a round letter, where there was like a secret language where people would not use the kinds of words that would bring them to the attention of McCarthy and others of that period.
Ah,
So,
right.
so like a rune brief would be, I'll write what I'm seeing in my practice. I send it to you. You write what you're seeing. You reflect on me. You'll send it to the next analyst. But Altman talks about this as a whitening of psychoanalysis, so that um, the analysts coming from this very dynamic environment uh, felt they had to buy into the medical model at that time, which was highly individualistic, highly medicalized, and keep their head down because they had already lost their home. They didn't want to fall into trouble here. And
Hmm.
so we come into a period of psychoanalysis that was much more conservative, and which is still to this day trying to cast off some of that in order to grapple with these really serious problems that we're up against now.
Hmm.
So I found out about
Yeah.
that maybe, I don't know, maybe 2000. Um, and
Wow.
at the time, I had set up this program at Pacifica where students, instead of doing psychotherapy, were doing engaged community and ecological fieldwork and research, with the idea that if in fact, we can't neatly divide the inner and the outer, then people who are psychologically minded can work in a whole variety of contexts alongside cultural workers and ecologically minded folks. And here I found out that was what
Hmm.
psychoanalysts were doing, um, 80 years before. Um, so, I was getting some critique that, what I was doing was too sociological. But I was able to draw on this early history and
Mm.
say, no, actually, there isn't a conflict here. There's a convergence.
I mean, I'd never heard this story before, and I'd heard Hillman critique uh, kind of where we were at with psychology and psychotherapy and its hyper individual perspective and focus. But he never really got into the history of how we got there.
No,
And it took you until 2000. You'd been in the field for a long time doing these deep
50 years.
investigations. Yeah, so I mean, this seems like a really kind of suppressed story or narrative.
Yeah, you can turn to Russell Jacoby, who was an early voice that was trying to tell this story, and then more recently at that time, Neil Altman.
Yeah, okay. Um, I'm curious. So you knew Hillman throughout his life. You stayed in contact with him until his death.
Yes.
What was his thoughts about what you were doing at Pacifica?
Well,
Because it seems to me that you're enacting what he was encouraging people to do is take therapy out of the clinical room and out into the world and become like real citizens, politically engaged, etc.
I think he was mixed.
Hmm.
Um, I think he appreciated that, um, and I think learned something from my own emphasis on justice. Uh, but he was more archetypal than myself, and I think he very much wanted to keep that aspect of the work alive, and I wasn't really engaged that much in that
Hmm.
aspect. Um, but yeah, we had a lot of wonderful sharing around ideas and just life itself.
Hmm. I've heard a lot of stories about him and how um, hawkish he could be and how kind of scary he could be at times. He could be so kind of sharp and pointed. And so, what was it like for you as a younger woman, someone, being with someone who's been a mentor and influence on you, to have a difference of opinion or ideas of how to go about this, bringing therapy into the world?
Well, I know the characterizations that you're bringing forward, but I've got to say, in my own relationship with him, um, I felt an enormous sense of intellectual support, and that was very um, precious to me because I am a woman, and at that period, um, this was not the average response of male intellectuals to women, right?
Hmm.
So I was very, very fortunate. He supported other young women like Nor Hall as well, and was very interested in our ideas and um, was not the harsh figure that people complained about during that time when he was in public audiences. And I can also say, for the many, many years I taught at Pacifica, he came every year while he was alive to speak with my and the other students. And as he got older, that the edge of him that was annoyed by what he might have thought of as stupid ideas or, um, really softened. And he
Hmm.
became more curious, um, less less critical, more humorous in those
Hmm.
situations. Um, so it was I thought a very delightful change, and part of it was that the period in which he was establishing himself in his own 40s and 50s, with the tweed jacket and the tie and the formal bearing and formal introductions and all that. Um, that all that all began to soften, and he was. I think he was increasingly available to his audiences and his students.
Yeah, yeah. At the end there, he really loved to get into the mix with people.
Yeah.
There's some great recordings of like say a weekend at the Omega Institute or I think the Rose Center in Massachusetts. There's one
Yes.
where he's really in the mix and encouraging people to pipe up and to push back. And that's so great to hear. And just, tracking his kind of development over his career through recordings and his writing, but particularly the recordings, because I think you really get a sense of the person and his sense
Yes.
of humor and playfulness and things like that. I wonder how much of that we can attribute to his involvement with the men's movement and engaging in these weekends and weeks with men and, guided by Robert Bly and Michael Mead. When I listen to the recordings of him in that situation, in the beginning, I can hear how just uncomfortable he is in that situation, in that context, with men who are like shouting back at him, and I think he felt like the nerd in the group. He talked about his like little pencil neck holding up his giant head and his weak arms and his wispy hair and things like that. I think that there's something about that really allowed him to kind of relax the persona of the scholarly authority or.
Yes, I suspect so too. And he was also backing away from psychotherapy. He stopped seeing people at a certain point, and became, not so directed in his writings toward the Jungian audience, but to people more generally, and really wanted a general audience. And in his as he got more comfortable in these kind of group settings, I think he really enjoyed it, and it was like it was something different, right? Than standing up as the expert and answering people's questions, but not being involved in that um, dialogical back and forth that was possible in the men's movement.
Mm. And of course, earlier on in the late 60s and through the 70s, he was so unorthodox that I think he really had to bring a lot of his Mars energy uh, to those engagements because people really were against him or.
Yeah, well, as I said, it was kind of split. I mean, there were those who were rigidly defending, Jungian sacred concepts,
Hmm.
and others who were like really, really happy to see him on the scene.
I just wanted to circle back and touch on this because it's a question that has just been lingering. So when we're talking about not containing the active imagination work to like the second half of analysis and those kind of strict boundaries put around that out of fear. I wanted to ask you because you're engaged in breaking that boundary and even working with groups like with the Dream Theater. I imagine that is a process of enacting the dream in a kind of gestalt way with people playing
Yes.
different. Yeah. Is there anything to be cautious about when engaging in active imagination outside the container of psychoanalysis, like doing it on your own, doing it with groups, doing it in a kind of improvisatory, free-form, renegade way? In your experience, is there actually some justification to the fear around that?
I haven't experienced that personally. Um, you want a setting in which people who may be going through a hard time can feel held and supported as they experience whatever it is that is arising. But again, getting back to that, to suicide in the soul, um, if something is trying to freely arise in psyche and we actually pay attention to it, it may have difficult content, but meeting it and listening to it, I think is very healing.
Hmm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I found the same. Yeah. But, I don't know everything, and I haven't had a lot of experiences that, that others may have had, and so I'm always open to the caution around it, and I do tread carefully when doing that kind of work with people. And I've been involved in some extreme situations, in ceremonies with ayahuasca, which is very powerful mind-altering substance, and seen people kind of lose their shit. Um, and at the end, everyone was fine. It can be a scary situation, I suppose, if you're kind of, if you have some fear of chaos or the unexpected,
Mm.
or,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I found that was, I think, one of the things that I appreciated about Hillman when I really got into his work, is that I could see how his approach could be utilized in those kind of contexts,
Yes.
and actually quite helpful in
Yes.
working with the figures, the experiences, the visions that come about in that kind of shamanic context.
Yeah, because you can have experiences where those images are just washing over you, right? Rather than slowing it down and engaging
Mm.
and really trying to listen to what the figures have to say. So I think that there's some discipline to active imagination that differentiates it from what Jung would call fantasy, right? Fantasy being, this and that comes through your mind, and you're not really trying to attend to it. It just, it's just washing over you.
Yeah, you're kind of watching it like a movie, or you're kind of
Yeah,
just
yeah,
thrown
like a
into the
passive
maelstrom.
person.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I thought active imagination, some of these terms I'm not super crazy about. So one of the ways I've revised that term, active imagination, is I call it interactive imagining.
Nice, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Uh,
I call it imaginal dialogues because
yeah,
when you look at the structure of our thoughts, um, they're extremely dialogical. Sometimes we can't tell. Like, let's say you're working on something, and then you have a critical voice. We often don't slow down enough to ask, well, who are you? And tell me about it. And really, like, sometimes, like, what is it to you? Why do you keep criticizing? Like, what's up with you, as well as, hearing what they think is up with us. Um, yeah, I think it's the dialogical part that's so important here. What differentiates imaginal dialogues from some things that happen in psychosis, for instance? Like, in some hallucinations, the voice will tell a person to do something, like jump out the window. And the person feels commanded and may jump out the window, or the person says, go hit that person over there, or
yeah,
whatever it
yeah, yeah.
is, right? So it's not actually a dialogue, it's a command, it's a monologue uh, that's directed at the self. In imaginal dialogue, it's very dialogical, back and forth, right? So
Yeah.
I think there's been a real confusion about hallucinations with active imagination. It's not the same.
Yeah, well, I think one of the fears is that if you engage in active imagination, if you tread into that world with somebody who is in I don't know, like a fragile or vulnerable state, is that they will fall into psychosis. But I think if you're doing active imagination, one of the things that is guarding against that is that you are, like you said, in dialogue. There is a sense of self, of me having a dialogue with this figure. And in
Right.
psychosis, I think it's the dissolution of the strong sense of self that leads you to be
Yes.
so susceptible to suggestion or these commands, right? The
Yes.
acting out
And
that
you
can be
experience them as very literal.
right. Right. And so, yeah, you're making a couple different moves there that Hillman talked a lot about, not falling into literalization. Well, let's bring Paulo Freire into the conversation. When did you encounter his work? From what I understand, it was quite a bit later after meeting Hillman.
Yeah, it would have been 11 years afterwards. It was 19, well, no, I guess just 10 years. It was 1984, and I was about to adopt a daughter from Northeast Brazil. And I began to try to read Brazilian poetry and listen to the music and figure out how to cook the food. And in that process of getting to know the northeast of Brazil, I found Paulo Freire's work. I'd never, I'd never read it before. And as soon as I began to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is the book he's best known for, um, I felt this was the missing piece
Mm,
that I had, you know, sometimes you're like looking for something, you don't even know exactly what it is, but when you find it, you realize, oh, I've been on a quest here. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. If you
And
knew what you were looking for, you would have been able to find it sooner. But
right,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. So I was like, oh my goodness, and just began to devour his writings, and they led me to the writings of people like Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon, and then a little bit later, Ignacio Martin Barrow, who actually named liberation psychology. But there's a beautiful story about Freire in the beginning. Well, maybe I should introduce Freire to your
Yeah, yeah. I
listeners.
was going to ask.
Yeah,
Well, tell
yeah,
people who he is or
yeah.
was.
So he grew up in Northeast Brazil, in Recife, and his father was um, a army person, and his mother a seamstress, I think. And they were comfortably in the middle class when the depression of the United States spilled over into Brazil, and they were thrown immediately into poverty. And Freire talks about um, being at school and being unable to concentrate because he was so hungry. And uh, he began to get a very first person sense of what so many people in the northeast of Brazil had long been experiencing. It's been a region of immense poverty, of droughts and floods, an area with very little literacy, very high um, birth, uh, child mortality rate.
Mm,
So when he grew up, he really wanted to increase literacy, and he started doing some experiments with that. He was able to teach 300 people how to read and write within a very short period of time. I think it was 90 days. And so the president at that point, Goulart, right before the military dictatorship, um, enlisted Freire to create a literacy movement. And Freire developed, I think, 200,000 cultural circles for people to be able
mm,
to learn to read when the military dictatorship closed all that down and imprisoned him. Um, but there was, so he was working to develop a methodology for teaching literacy, but he wanted it to be more than just learning to read words. He wanted people to begin to learn to read the context in which their lives were unfolding so that they could begin to question it critically, and to denaturalize it. So instead of
mm,
thinking,
mhm.
yes, this is very difficult, very tragic, etc. I've just lost three more children, but such is the way of life, such is the way of that God has ordained it to be. A sense of fatalism. Freire wanted to to begin through what he called generative questioning to help people unearth their own understandings and to put those understandings together. It was very important that um, developing consciousness happened in a group. It wasn't just between two people, as in psychotherapy. So, for instance, a mother might say within such a group, I'm very depressed. Why are you very depressed? Because my child can't go on in school. Why not? He doesn't have a pair of shoes. Why doesn't he have a pair of shoes? What did people in your family used to be able to go on to school? What how is your life arranged such that there's no money for shoes? Who are you working for and how have they arranged things? And oftentimes you would find, for instance, that the person who was paying the agricultural workers was also in charge of the store, owned the store. And so pretty soon people owed more money than they were owed. Very similar in the US South, um, after the Civil War for African Americans. Um, so one night he went to a meeting of workers who had asked him to come, and he gave a talk, and um, he left. And going home, his wife Ilsa was not paying him much attention, and he's like, Ilsa, how did you think of it? What did you think of my talk? And she said, well, your talk was very good, but you never asked them what they thought. You never you never asked them what they thought about what you thought. Um, and Freire realized, oh, he had fallen into being the person who knew and delivering his knowings to other people,
Hmm.
and that he had missed connecting with them. And in fact, he'd had several other situations. I remember one where a man confronted him, like, what do you know about how to bring up a child when you have no money and they're hungry? You live in a house, etc. So he began to create a much more participatory, dialogical approach and talked about his earlier approach, which was consonant with the way education was in Brazil generally, and probably here as well. He called that a banking model of education. So the teacher opens up the top of the head, pours in the facts, asks the student to regurgitate them, and call that learning. And Freire said, no, okay, if we want to help to create communities where people are in vibrant dialogue with each other, where they're capable of creating new realities with each other, we have to create a setting in which people can bring to voice their ideas, their opinions, perspectives, and listen to other people. And then, importantly, to imagine how they would most like their daily reality to be, so that as a group, you can begin to chart steps between the way things are and the way you you most deeply desire them to be. He called that enunciation. So the first part of his methodology was called conscientization, or the development of critical consciousness. So yeah, how people would become much more aware of how the hurdles that to their own well-being and their community's well-being, how who was placing what was placing those hurdles in the way, how were they constructed, who was served by them, and how might they be dismantled, and other forms of life created.
Yeah. So that line of inquiry that you demonstrated just a little earlier there, that would be the kind of thing that you're talking about, the generative questions that develop critical consciousness.
Yes.
Interesting to know, as you're going through that, I realized that psychotherapy stops at the very first question. You know, like why are you depressed? Or it stays focused on that, right? And it ends
Yes,
there. And then
right.
you kept going with all these other questions that broaden the inquiry to its social context.
Yes. Yeah, so I began to realize that in most therapies, that the therapist never asks you, tell me about the school that you went to. What was it like? Tell me who your great grandparents were. What were they involved in? Um, were your parents in? Did they vote? Who did they vote for? Why did they vote for who they voted for? Um, what was the role of religion in your family? You know,
Hmm.
um, somehow we had shrunk down inquiry into the relationship between you and your mother, you know, you
Maybe
and
dad,
your
if he was
partner, maybe
abusive.
your dad, maybe your dad.
Mhm.
Um, but the rest of the world was like shorn away. And I think now, I think I understand that that is part of what we call white consciousness. Um, that's also a part of what some would say is a privilege of white consciousness, white privilege, but which I don't actually think is very much of a privilege. And
Hmm.
that is to think of yourself as an individual. Everything you have and do is a result of your own efforts. And if you have any psychological problems, you can get those fixed up in some sort of interior sort of way. So you don't really have to um, go upstream to where are these problems coming from? You
Hmm.
know, historically, intergenerationally, culturally, economically, um, what's feeding in to the issues that a person brings into the therapy room. So so Freire wasn't doing psychotherapy, but he was doing profoundly healing work um, with groups. Unfortunately, he was imprisoned for 90 days. He was termed a Bolshevik and an enemy against the Brazilian people by the military dictatorship because they, just like many people in the white South, didn't want people to learn to read and write. Well, in the South, it was not wanting African Americans to learn to read and write. In Brazil, it was poor people because they could be more easily controlled, and their labor could be more easily siphoned off into creating wealth for other people. So, what Freire was doing was deemed revolutionary in what the regime thought was um, counterproductive to their motives and aims. But he pursued his work. He published Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He worked um, with the like the United Nations in Africa and various places. And eventually he came back to Brazil after the end of the military dictatorship and was given the post of being the head of the Department of Education in Sao Paulo, that was at that time the largest educational system in the world. But in Brazil, there's still an extreme split between those who deeply honor his work and those who still see it as insurgent, I guess, transgressive. Um,
Gosh, I mean, it's wild to think that people would be so threatened by literacy.
it's the gate. It's the gate to understanding, and that's why he was connecting this, the literal literacy with the more metaphorical task of
Right, or like
decoding
cultural
your
literacy,
world.
we might call
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, well, wonderful. Now, I can imagine people listening going, well, he's not doing psychotherapy, so how does this relate to James Hillman, who is doing this therapy of ideas and putting psychotherapy on the therapeutic couch and analyzing it and all of that? In this chapter that you contributed to, a tribute to James Hillman, renegade psychologist, in 2014, Hillman and Freire, intellectual accompaniment by two fathers, you take some of their ideas that you see as kind of complementary or overlapping in different ways. And I thought maybe we could just go through some of those. You've
Good.
already talked about Freire's idea of attaining critical consciousness. In the chapter, you relate that to Hillman's idea of seeing through.
Yes.
Yeah, can you explain that?
So Hillman is wanting us to deepen our experiences beyond our literal conception of them. And so he's wanting to be able to restore the imaginal background to things that we experience. So for instance, if you're to say I'm feeling depressed is not, it doesn't give us that much information. But if you ask a person, well, what is it like? And one person might say, I feel like um, I feel like I'm a bathtub and somebody opened the drain and all the water just poured out and I'm left completely empty. Another person might say, um, I feel like this fire inside of me that is just destroying everything that I thought I cared about. And I'm at a loss what to do. So you see, you have we have one word depression, but many different experiences. And Hillman, by seeing through and psychologizing, he's trying to um, open up the literal things that the person is saying and restore their imaginal background. Now, Freire is also trying to open up the literal things that people are saying. But in his case, he's trying to restore the historical, cultural, economic background to what it is they're saying. Now, so very different in some ways, but they converge around things like um, ideology. Freire's method is a method of what's called, it's a difficult word to say, de-ideologization.
Good job.
so so we have certain things that we believe and we take for granted, we naturalize them. So in my last podcast with you, we were taking the ideology of whiteness and white supremacy. And what we would want to do is denaturalize that, realize that it's an idea that was constructed at a particular time for a particular purpose. It serves some particular groups and does not serve other particular groups. And so we're doing some seeing through of the ideology until we can get to an idea that we can work with and get curious about. And Freire was also trying to do this kind of de-ideologization, for it for the sake of liberation.
Mhm.
Um, so that's one way in which they meet. The second is really their the primacy that they give to the imagination. So it's clear in Hillman. I think we've been talking about that, but in Freire, the second part of the process that he calls enunciation, or another word for it might be prophetic imagination,
Oh, I like
was
that.
was completely essential because, um, for instance, we could begin to understand um, how we got to a point in our history where fascism has become popular
Mhm. And
um,
normalized, yeah.
and normalized. Um, we need to be able to denaturalize it, obviously, but also to be very clear on what it is we're proposing in its stead, so
Yeah.
that we can make a path from here to there. And um, I knit this together with Elise Boulding's work. She's a sociologist who translated the multiple volumes of Francis Pollack's work called The Image of the Future after the Second World War. And when she came to the US, she used a process of imagining that was called Imagining the World Without Weapons. She was also a Quaker.
Mm,
Um, so what was really neat about what she did was she would have people imagine 30 years from now, what would it be like if we'd gotten rid of nuclear weapons? Okay, and then imagine back in 5 year periods, what would need to have happened in each of those periods to be able to get to this outcome.
mhm.
So this was a method I used with my students around their field work. Like, what are your hopes for this ultimately? Like, you're just going to be involved in this for a few years, but but when you talk with the people in the group that you're accompanying, what's the vision of the future, and how might you get from where you are now to where you're going? And Freire was
Great.
completely involved in his own version of this. So, for instance, if there was no clean water, um, had it always been the case that there was no clean water? When there was clean water, what happened to it? What were the forces that made it not? What were the the dangers of it? For instance, a high mortality rate amongst babies. Um, how might they begin to reinstitute ways of living and ways of dealing with the forces that were um, polluting their water? So, um, so again, the two men were doing something different with imagination, but they each really understood that you couldn't get along without it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, like so many things have been attributed over the years, like different wars, terrorist attacks, things like that, as a failure of imagination, even by very conventional, authoritative figures in the military, for instance. Even
Yes,
they recognize that some of these
yes,
difficulties, some of these catastrophes are due to a failure of imagination. What
yes,
they do with that is another thing. I think they might have a
yeah.
very limited imagination in terms of dealing with things, but I love this
Um,
idea of the prophetic imagination, imagining how things might be otherwise.
yeah, yeah, and the what was so brilliant about Boulding's approach to this was if you just take where you are now and where you want to go, it looks impossible.
Hmm.
But if you break it down into various stages along the way where your desires are not complete, but it's messy, but you're a few steps ahead, you 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 can gain the energy to go forward. Another place they really converged was around the relationship between reflection and action.
Hmm.
They both really disliked binaries, and they, Freire said, to have action without reflection is essentially stupid, right? You don't want to take action without having prior perfect reflection, but you don't
Right.
want to just
You could say it's blind.
blind, right?
Yeah.
But you also don't want to have reflection that's what he called mere verbalism without any action.
Hmm.
And Hillman rejected that there should be any dichotomy between these two, that they actually belong together.
Hmm.
And
And
I think in his
well, he even said reflection is an action.
yes, yes, is an action. And I think in the last 20 years of his life, when he was really addressing things like transportation systems, economic systems, um, white supremacy, et cetera, he was really, kind of working with reflection and action together, and working with groups to that had certain aims that they wanted to accomplish, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And so, I mean, is that as much as you want to say about what Freire saw as that? I mean, it kind of just makes sense
Yes.
when you put them together and you go, well, of course. And I think one of the critiques that some people have of, the so-called social justice warriors is that it's all reflection and critique. They're not doing that prophetic imagination of like, okay, so everything we've been doing it wrong, but how would you like to do it? There's
Yes.
a lack of the maybe the reflective depth or the prophetic imagining. And so I think even just some of these ideas are still important for people to hear and to consider and be, yeah, to be instructed on.
Right. I think so too. I mean, we're really at a moment where we need to put these ideas into action.
Hmm. And we need proper deep reflection.
Yes.
Yeah. And that opens you up to like you really complexify the narrative when you do that, um, which can be what can kind of get people hmm, what's the word I'm looking for? I imagine like if you go back and you really try to understand the context of how things came about, and you're not just looking for, to support one particular narrative, that it does get more complex.
Yes.
That might be stultifying to someone, just kind of confounding to the agenda, to the ideology, because it would tend to break apart the ideology if you really do the
Yes.
archaeology around it.
Right.
It's not so black and white. It's not so cut and dry who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. As we discussed in our previous conversation about your archaeology into your own background as a Quaker and the
Yes.
Quakers' implication into slavery and all of that.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
not the lovable, quiet peaceniks in the house of friendship. It's complicated,
It's complicated. Right.
but that shouldn't stop you from then acting in some way.
Right.
Just
Yes.
because it's not clear, it's not cut and dry. Yeah, how do you go forward if the action isn't so clear? Because to make it so clear would be have some idea of what the right solution is, and think Hillman did caution against that. Don't be sure you know exactly what's needed or how things will end up.
You
So how do
know,
we then go forward with that sense of uncertainty or
well, another Brazilian who's very important in all this is Augusto Boal, who crafted what he called the theater of the oppressed. And he has two words he uses that I think are very important. One is rehearsal, and the other is improvisation.
huh?
Um, like we we can't know if our actions are definitely going to contribute to the end that we desire. Sometimes actions actually act the opposite way, right? But we can improvise and then study the effects of the actions and then adjust our course accordingly. So there we're talking about the practice of humility,
Hmm.
which I think is what Freire learned from Ilsa in the narrative, the story I told you. Um, that yes, you don't know for sure, but that shouldn't paralyze you. Um, you can you can be involved in a rehearsal for um, for what you want to see come. And some people call this another word I really like, prefiguration. So it may be that at any one moment, it's not the time or even possible to change a structure altogether. But there can be places where that structure has been dissolved or replaced with something else, where people can experiment with living in that way. For instance, Lang's improvisation around living with people with schizophrenia.
Yeah,
Um,
he didn't know what he was doing or what the outcome would be. He was
right.
following an intuition about it. Or
Yes, exactly. And so a lot of bell hooks used to use this word home place. Um, and it was picked up by Thich Nhat Hanh and Daniel Berrigan as well. A place where you can come back to yourself, where there's a sense of safety, where um, your relationships can be authentic. There can be differences, but you have modes of listening to each other and working them through. And it might be impossible to do that, say, for instance, if you're at a university within a protest or an academic synod or whatever, but you might have a group of friends with whom you can create a home place. And that's a prefiguration of what you would like to see in the wider world, but which, you haven't gotten traction beyond where it is right now.
Mm,
And that,
mhm.
that's the idea of a sanctuary city.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very, very powerful idea to take a region and create a way of living together that is transgressive. And that's why I believe in our country, these cities are under attack right now, um, because it took enormous energy to set up cities and towns as sanctuaries. Um, and, mm, it's been about 45 years since that movement began in the United States. Um, and it's no wonder that in the first days of Trump's administration, that's what he goes after.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's transgressing the dominant culture and its norms. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's saying, no, people are forced to migrate. And actually, during the time when the sanctuary movement was created, people were being forced to migrate from places like El Salvador because of US backed counterinsurgency, right?
Yeah.
Um, so these are people who are worthy of our empathy, our compassion, and our assistance. Um, they ought to be able to find refuge, uh, and that people who are involved in the current immigration conversation along MAGA lines um, want to extinguish that kind of talk.
Mm. I mean, that's such a great example of what we could perform that sort of Freirean inquiry on. Why did these people come here? What forced them to leave? What created the conditions there? Oh, it comes back to our foreign policies and actions. Huh. And that might engender maybe some like compassion for
Yeah.
these people.
Well, you would hope. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, if you could do
yeah,
dare to do the questioning,
yeah,
dare to do
yeah.
the inquiry in the first place.
Well, it did engender compassion. It did create sanctuary cities and
Yeah, amongst
towns,
some.
and
Yeah.
the extending of medical benefits to forced migrants, etc. It just didn't happen for enough people.
Hmm. Yeah, and even when you're talking about the sanctuary cities, I'm kind of seeing that there's a prefiguration of that in something like the Underground Railroad.
Yes,
Slaves escaping the
absolutely.
South and coming into Canada and setting up these small colonies in Eastern Canada.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
And so the sanctuary city is just a kind of an expansion of that idea in a way. Um,
Jacques Derrida had this really interesting idea that affected me a lot. He talked about you have to figure out at any one time what the level of organization is that that you can act on an idea in. So,
mhm,
for instance, with forced migration, the U.S. hasn't been as a nation hasn't been able to reform its immigration policy in decades and decades. And while there's been a lot of attention to that, it hasn't been an area that has moved. And so Derrida said, well, okay, then you would drop down to the level of the state. Can the state um, create a sense of refuge? Well, whole states were not able to do that either. Well, how about a city? Yes. Within cities and towns, there was the possibility of gaining traction with those ideas. Now, if it turns out, God hope not, um, that sanctuary cities and towns were destroyed, you have to keep that idea alive in the neighborhood. in the family, in your area of your school, right?
Yeah,
You have to keep the idea alive at the level of organization at which it can be kept alive.
right. All the way down to something like Anne Frank's attic.
Absolutely. You got it.
Yeah. Huh. That's great. Wow. You've done a really good job. I know I wasn't super articulate sometimes with my questions. I'm really reaching for things that you've already reached for, and so you're able to kind of see what I'm going for and articulate it more clearly and with a lot of background. And I just really appreciate that. You've done some really good accompaniment, to use one of your favorite words, I think,
Well, I've really enjoyed
through this.
talking with you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, like, and this might have come up in one of Hillman's lectures or something I read from him, but his call for the kind of the Western mind to go to the South. And he was talking about the south of Europe, places like Florence, where the kind of the polytheistic imagination flourished in the Renaissance and things like that. And for me, coming with this background in shamanic practices from South America, both Brazil and Peru, and also yoga from Southern India. One of my things that, one of my dialogues I had with Hillman early on was like, man, you didn't go far enough south.
Yeah.
Like keep going, brother, to the southern hemisphere. And I guess, it occurred to me as we were speaking that that's kind of what you've done as well. You've seen how if you keep going further south to the liberation psychologies of South America, that it can really, I don't know what, fill out the picture for us in terms
Yes.
of what we need to do in this globalized world that we live in.
Yeah, it can really shine a critical light on the way that psychotherapy is organized, I think, and the limitations that it has imposed on itself. So it's not like you just glue them together and it works out. It's more like a critique that you can use from the South that I think helps us deepen into um, the cultural realities in which we're living.
Right. Like it helps us to get out of ourselves or out of our perspective, our myopic perspective, to see ourselves from the outside and understand, just like everything we've been talking about, it's like a microcosm, macrocosm thing that the world affects us and we have an effect on the world. And there are consequences. Oh, I think you've frozen up.
It's radically
Oh,
critiquing individualism and giving us um, a vibrant sense of interdependence, I think.
I'm sorry. You were frozen there, and I think it just kind of cut back in halfway through what you were saying.
Okay, so I think the shift is it radically the seeing from the South is a radical critique of individualism upon which most Western psychology is based. And it gives us instead a very vibrant understanding of interdependence, including with the natural world, right?
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mary. I greatly appreciate you and your work and the time you've given us here, and launching this celebration of James Hillman's work. And
Yay. Happy
yeah,
birthday to revisioning psychology. Wonderful.
yeah.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and we'll see you
Okay,
down the road. Take care.
great. Bye bye.
Bye.